In the heart of the wild frontier, one prospector faced the deadliest winter of his life. Isolated in the freezing wilderness, he had only his wits and grit to survive. Watch how one clever invention, a backdoor tunnel, became the key to keeping his supplies safe from the relentless cold. Will this forgotten survival tactic be the thing that saves him? Find out in this epic tale of survival, innovation, and the unforgiving forces of nature. Don't miss out, click to watch now. The mountain air was thick with the promise of winter. Samuel Bridger had lived through countless snowstorms in his years in the Rockies, but nothing had ever felt like this. The cold sank into his bones, seeping past his furs, biting into his skin, and numbing his very spirit. The snow fell relentlessly, a curtain of white that blurred the world into a single frozen nightmare. His cabin, nestled at the foot of a towering peak, seemed to shudder beneath the force of the wind. He had seen deep winters before, the kind that turned rivers to ice and silenced the forests, but this was different. The trees groaned under the weight of the snow, their branches drooping like the shoulders of a man too weary to stand. The sun was little more than a dim shadow, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves, a constant reminder of the storm's power. Samuel huddled near his fireplace, the flames dancing weakly, struggling against the biting chill that had already crept through every crack in the walls. The trail to the nearest settlement was now impassable, buried under snowdrifts and hidden by the swirling winds. The food stores in his cabin were running low, and if the storm persisted, it would be weeks before he could make the trek to gather more supplies. His situation had turned from precarious to desperate in a matter of days, and he knew he had only one option. He had to survive until the thaw. The storm raged for days. Samuel was no stranger to adversity. He had lived in the wilderness for decades, learning the harsh realities of mountain life, but this season was testing him in ways he had never imagined. The temperature plunged to levels that seemed unnatural, colder than any winter he had encountered before. He knew he had to act quickly to protect what little he had left. His food was stored in the root cellar, but that alone wouldn't keep it from freezing solid in this kind of cold. His firewood, stacked carefully beside the cabin, was slowly being consumed by the flames, and he couldn't afford to burn it all. He had learned long ago that the wilderness was unforgiving, and any mistake could mean death. But in the face of this bone-chilling cold, he felt a spark of something else: hope. He had heard stories from the old-timers of a method used by early pioneers, a backdoor tunnel, carved into the earth, designed to keep supplies safe from the cold. It was a simple idea, but it had worked in the past. Samuel decided that, if he was to survive this storm, he would need to dig his own tunnel. It would take all his strength, but he had no other choice. The wind howled through the mountain pass, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of the pack. Samuel Donnelly, his face set against the cold, could feel the presence of the wolves even before he saw them. He had spent 6 winters in these highlands, trapping, hunting, living on the edge of civilization. But this winter was different. The wolves had become bolder, more dangerous. Their howls echoed off the cliffs like a symphony of hunger, and every shadow seemed to be watching him. The storm that had rolled in without warning had buried the forest under a thick blanket of snow. It wasn't the snow itself that worried him, but the wolves. They had been tracking him for days, their deep paw prints a reminder that nature was closing in. The mountain was a cruel and unforgiving place, and the wolves were its silent, relentless hunters. Samuel had survived countless dangers in his time on the frontier. He had fought off bears, outwitted countless traps, and endured the harshest winters. But the wolves were different. They didn't just hunt for food. They hunted for sport, and they had no mercy. The sound of their howling sent a shiver down his spine as he moved cautiously through the snow, his eyes scanning the darkening forest. As night began to fall, Samuel knew that he had to make a decision. He could try to make it back to his cabin, but the wolves were closing in. They were too smart, too fast. His best chance of survival lay in outsmarting them, but how? The answer came to him as he scanned his surroundings. He had a plan, one that would take all his cunning and experience, but it was the only chance he had. The cold winds continued to howl, and the shadows of the wolves grew closer. Samuel moved swiftly, his breath coming in quick bursts. He was no longer just running from the storm, he was running for his life. The wilderness had claimed many before him, and unless he acted quickly, it would claim him too. The howling grew louder, the wolves' call a chilling reminder that there was no escaping the wild. In the distance, he could see the glow of his cabin's hearth. If he could make it back before the wolves caught up to him, he might just survive. But as he made his way through the thick snow, he knew that the wilderness would test him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. The wolves weren't his only danger. The storm was closing in, and if he didn't act fast, he might lose everything. The cold winds clawed at the cabin's doorframe as Ezra Cole sat hunched over the meager fire in his hearth. The fire flickered weakly, the warm glow battling against the bitter chill that seeped through the cracks in the walls of his small cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. Outside, the snow piled higher with each passing hour, and the storm's relentless howl echoed across the valley. Inside, it felt as though the world had disappeared, leaving only the bitter silence of winter. Ezra had lived in these mountains for over 2 decades, a man hardened by the trials of frontier life. He knew the land like the back of his hand, its hidden dangers, its rhythms, its quiet beauty. But this winter was unlike any other. The snow came earlier, the winds more savage, and the cold more punishing. Each gust seemed to reach into the bones, gnawing at the strength of any man who dared to face it. The storm had trapped Ezra in his cabin, leaving him with little to do but wait. The days stretched into weeks, each one colder than the last. His food supplies were holding out, but only just. He had no idea how long the storm would last, or how long he could continue living off what little he had left. His only solace was the warmth of the fire, though it too seemed to be losing its battle against the deep chill. As the days passed, Ezra's thoughts turned to survival. He had seen the seasons change, watched as the winter storms came and went, but this year the wilderness was testing him in ways he had never expected. His cabin, built with his own hands, was sturdy, but it was no match for the power of the storm. He needed to find a way to keep himself and his supplies safe and quickly. Ezra had heard stories of mountain men who dug into the earth to store food, creating hidden root cellars deep enough to avoid the freezing temperatures. He had never needed to rely on such measures, but the idea was beginning to sound more and more like his only option. With the cold growing more severe each night, he knew he needed to act fast. He stood, the weight of his furs and the exhaustion of days spent huddled by the fire pulling at his limbs. But there was no time to waste. He gathered his tools, an axe, a shovel, and a small lantern to light his way and set out into the storm. The snow was deep, the wind howling around him, but Ezra was resolute. He had survived winters far worse than this. He had no choice but to dig deep into the earth and protect the food that would keep him alive. As he hacked through the frozen ground, the wind pushed against him, threatening to blow him off course. But Ezra pressed on, determined. The storm was not going to take him without a fight. He dug deeper into the earth, carving a small space to store his provisions. Each shovelful of snow and ice felt like a victory against the wilderness, each blow a reminder that he was still in control. The cold bit into his skin, but Ezra didn't stop. He could feel the mountain pushing back, but he was pushing harder. He would survive this winter, just as he had survived the many winters before it, and when the thaw finally came, he would be ready. John McAllister stood at the threshold of his cabin, staring out into the swirling mass of snow and wind. The first gusts had come just before sundown, cold and unforgiving. The storm was arriving with a fury unlike any he had seen before. He had lived in the frontier for years, built his life around the harsh realities of the land, but this storm felt different. It was as though the mountain itself had decided to rise up and challenge him, testing his every decision, every step. John had always believed that nature was something to be respected, not feared. He had weathered many storms in his time, had built shelters that withstood the harshest winters, and had hunted the fiercest of creatures. But something about this blizzard made him uneasy. The winds howled as if alive, and the snow fell in thick sheets, making it nearly impossible to see beyond the edges of his cabin's porch. The wilderness was waking up, and it was angry. He pulled his thick woolen coat tighter around his shoulders, feeling the weight of the cold pressing in. The fireplace inside the cabin was still warm, the embers casting a soft glow, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to hold back the storm that was fast approaching. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and making the logs in the walls groan in protest. John could feel the pressure of the storm building, and he knew he had to prepare. There was no telling how long the blizzard would last. The storm was coming for him, and there was no escaping it. The best he could do was batten down the hatches and wait it out. He checked the supplies inside his cabin, ensuring that everything was secure. His firewood was stacked neatly by the door, and his food stores were carefully rationed. He had learned the hard way to never underestimate the wilderness, and now, it seemed, it was testing him again. John moved to the window, watching as the snow began to pile up against the cabin walls. The wind whipped through the trees, bending them low, and he could see the snow drifting in every direction. The land was being swallowed by the storm, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But he had lived through worse, and he wasn't about to let this blizzard take him down. The storm would pass, just as they always did. But until it did, John McAllister would endure. He had survived the wilderness before, and he would survive it again. His cabin would hold, his supplies would last, and when the snow finally stopped falling, he would be ready to face whatever came next. The wilderness was his home, and he was determined to keep it that way. Jonathan Calloway leaned against the rough-hewn walls of his cabin, the flames from the hearth flickering weakly in the dim light. Outside, the snowstorm raged with increasing intensity, its fury relentless as it howled down from the mountain ridges. Inside, the small fire did little to push back the cold that crept in through every crack in the walls. The wood stove, which had served him faithfully for so many years, struggled to keep the cabin warm against the winter's bite. It was late in the evening, and the snow had been falling for hours. The Appalachian winter had come early this year, and it was as cruel as ever. Jonathan had seen many snowstorms in his time, but this one was unlike any other. The wind howled with a piercing, almost malicious intensity, as if the mountain itself had awoken and decided to test his resolve. Jonathan had come to the mountains years ago to escape the noise and the demands of the world. The wilderness had become his home, its rhythms his own. But this winter was different. The temperature had dropped so low that even the seasoned outdoorsman found himself struggling to stay warm. The fire in his cabin seemed to shrink with each passing hour, as if the cold outside was somehow feeding on its warmth. Sitting near the hearth, Jonathan could hear the wind scraping against the cabin walls, the sound like claws dragging across stone. It was unnerving. He had been alone in these mountains for a long time, but he had never experienced this level of isolation. The storm outside felt alive, as if it were a force that had its own purpose, a purpose that would not be ignored. It was a harsh reminder that in the wild, nature held the power, and man was at its mercy. Jonathan's thoughts turned to survival. He had long since run out of firewood for the stove, and he knew that soon enough the cold would take its toll. He had enough supplies for a few more days, but after that he would be forced to venture out into the storm to find more. The wind outside was becoming more intense by the minute, and the snow was already several feet deep. The mountain pass was nearly impossible to navigate in such conditions, but Jonathan knew that his options were running thin. He could hear the wind picking up again, and with it, the whispering sound of the trees bending under the strain of the snow. It was as if the mountain was speaking to him, warning him of what was to come. Jonathan had no choice but to prepare for the worst. His body ached from the cold, but he moved quickly, gathering his tools and supplies. He had to find a way to protect himself from the storm. It was either that or risk being swallowed by the very wilderness he had come to love. He stepped outside into the biting cold, the snow instantly stinging his face. The storm was here in full force, and the mountain was waiting, watching. Jonathan gritted his teeth and set his eyes on the horizon. If he was going to survive this winter, he would have to face the storm head-on and hope that, in the end, he could outlast it. Noah Patterson stared through the fogged window of his log cabin, watching the blizzard take shape outside. The snow came in relentless waves, biting and savage, swirling with a fury that seemed to swallow the very landscape. He had built this cabin himself, stone by stone, wood by wood, in the hopes of finding peace in the isolation of the Wyoming plains. But as the storm raged, he realized how fragile his dreams of solitude had truly been. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, a faint source of warmth in a cabin that felt increasingly like a tomb. The storm outside had already begun to creep in. the cold seeping through the walls despite his best efforts to seal every crack. Noah pulled his thick woolen cloak tighter around his shoulders and stepped away from the window, moving toward the warmth of the fire. But the flames, though bright, offered little comfort against the fierce cold that now seemed to permeate every corner of his life. He had chosen this life for its simplicity, to escape the chaos of the world, but in this moment the quiet was suffocating. His hands were rough from years of work, calloused from building this cabin, from hunting, from trapping, but now they felt helpless. The storm had come faster than he had anticipated, and he wasn't prepared. His woodpile, stacked high outside, was beginning to dwindle. He had enough for a few more days, but what then? Noah knew better than anyone that the wilderness was unforgiving. He had spent years in its embrace, but this storm felt different. It wasn't just a typical winter storm, this was a beast, a creature with a mind of its own, determined to break him. The cabin groaned under the weight of the wind, its foundation shaking as if it too were struggling to withstand the storm's wrath. Noah had always prided himself on his ability to survive. He had built this cabin with his own hands, had lived off the land, and had always managed to find a way through the toughest of times. But now, as the blizzard pressed in from all sides, he felt small. The land he had once tamed seemed to be reclaiming its power, and Noah was at its mercy. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Noah knew that the snow would continue to fall through the night, and if it kept up, he wouldn't be able to get out to restock his firewood. The cold was biting, and he could feel it creeping into his bones. His breath came in small, visible puffs, and his fingers began to numb despite the warmth of the fire. He had to think quickly. He scanned his cabin for anything that might help. His stove, the one he had built to combat the bitter cold, was still keeping the worst of the chill at bay, but even it couldn't hold out forever. He needed a solution, something, anything, that would give him the edge in this battle against the wilderness. Noah's eyes landed on a pile of leather straps in the corner. A makeshift invention, something he had been tinkering with in the off-season. The cold had forced his hand. Noah sprang into action, gathering his materials. If he couldn't rely on the fire or his supplies to see him through this storm, he would have to rely on his own ingenuity. The storm had pushed him to his limit, but Noah knew one thing. He wasn't going to let it win. He had survived before, and he would survive again. As the storm howled outside, Noah worked quickly, piecing together his creation. The wind raged against the walls of the cabin, but inside there was hope. The storm might be fierce, but Noah Patterson was fiercer, and as long as the fire still burned, he would not give up. The storm outside had swallowed the world whole, reducing the vast expanse of the frontier to a white blur. Ezra Cole stood in the dim glow of his cabin, his breath visible in the cold air that lingered despite the fire crackling in the hearth. The snow had piled up so high that it seemed as though the earth itself had been buried beneath the weight of winter. He had never felt so alone, so distant from the world he had once known. The wind howled through the trees outside, its mournful cry a constant companion to Ezra's thoughts. It was the kind of cold that wrapped itself around your bones, seeping into your very marrow, and no matter how tightly you huddled against it, it never truly let go. Inside the cabin, the fire struggled to maintain its warmth, the flames flickering weakly as though they too were exhausted from the battle. Ezra sat on the edge of his bed, his fur-lined coat draped across his shoulders. His thoughts turned to the root cellar he had dug days earlier, the secret underground storage space he had carved into the frozen earth. It had been a gamble, but it had been the only choice he had. Without it, he would have lost his remaining supplies to the cold, and without those supplies, survival would have been impossible. His hands were numb from the cold, and his muscles ached from the constant strain of staying warm. The storm outside had pushed him to the brink, testing every ounce of his strength and resolve. But Ezra wasn't one to give up. He had fought the wilderness for years and survived by trusting his instincts, by relying on the skills he had honed over decades in the mountains. Now, that same wilderness was pushing back, harder than ever before. As the storm raged outside, Ezra found himself contemplating the road ahead. He had always known that life on the frontier was fraught with danger, but this winter had brought with it a new kind of challenge. He had dug deep into the earth to protect his supplies, but he had also dug deep into himself, tapping into a well of strength he hadn't known existed. He had come to the mountains to escape, to live a simpler life, but the wilderness had proven to be a relentless teacher. The snow continued to fall, each flake a reminder of the forces beyond his control. Ezra had learned over the years that the wilderness could be both a friend and a foe, offering beauty and danger in equal measure. It was a constant battle, one that he had to fight each day. But despite the cold, despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, Ezra held on to a small spark of hope. As long as he had the will to survive, as long as he could keep his fire burning, there was always a chance to endure, to outlast, and to conquer the storm. Noah Patterson stood in the middle of his cabin, staring at the invention he had cobbled together from scraps and ingenuity. The storm outside had intensified, the howling winds now a constant, deafening roar that rattled the cabin's walls and shook the roof with every gust. Yet inside, there was a strange calm. He had worked through the night, using what little he had left to create a makeshift solution, a more efficient way to keep his cabin warm and his food from freezing. His survival depended on it. Noah's hands were raw and calloused, his fingers aching from the endless work. The storm had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. His creation, a combination of insulated blankets and a modified heating system, was crude, but it was the only chance he had left. He had learned over the years that survival in the wild wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about adaptation, the ability to bend with the wind, to find new ways to endure. The wind shrieked outside, rattling the windows as if the very mountain were trying to tear his cabin apart. Noah couldn't afford to waste time. He had already lost too much precious firewood, and without it, the cold would soon consume him. But this new system, it was working. Slowly but surely, the temperature inside the cabin was rising. The makeshift heater he had rigged up was holding its own against the fierce cold outside. Noah smiled to himself, though it was a tired, worn smile. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. He had fought the storm with everything he had, and he had found a way to stay warm, to protect the little bit of life he had left in the midst of the wilderness fury. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to rest his aching body and look around at the results of his efforts. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, but his new system was holding steady. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in days, Noah felt a sense of control. The wilderness might be wild, but it was also malleable. And as long as he could adapt, as long as he could find a way to bend the storm to his will, he would survive. But as he sat in the dim light, listening to the wind howl and the snow fall in waves outside, Noah realized that survival was not just about outlasting the storm, it was about what came after. What would he do when the storm passed? What kind of life would be left for him on the other side of this relentless winter? For now, though, he would take solace in the small victory of warmth. The storm was still fierce, still raged outside, but Noah Patterson had faced it head-on and found a way to endure. As the wind howled and the snow continued to blanket the world outside, he clung to the one thing that the storm couldn't take from him, his will to survive. The howling wind outside had finally settled, though the snow still fell in soft, endless flurries. Inside his cabin, Jonathan Calloway sat by the dwindling fire, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. The storm had raged for weeks, but tonight there was a sense of finality in the air. The worst had passed. The storm had claimed its toll, but it had also left behind a quiet, peaceful stillness that was almost surreal. Jonathan had weathered the worst of the winter, and now, as he sat in his cabin, listening to the quiet after the chaos, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. The fire in the hearth had finally settled into a gentle warmth, and the crackling logs seemed to be telling him that the worst was over. His supplies were nearly gone, but he had enough to make it through the next few days. The world outside might still be a frozen wilderness, but inside, he had a quiet peace. The blizzard had tested him in ways he had never imagined, but he had held on. The fire was now the only thing keeping him connected to the world, and he knew that soon he would be able to leave the cabin and step back into the world that had nearly claimed him. For now, though, he was content to sit by the fire and wait for the dawn. The storm had passed, and he had survived. The first light of Dawn broke through the dark clouds, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered landscape. Noah Patterson stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching as the storm slowly released its grip on the wilderness. The snow still lay thick on the ground, but the winds had calmed, and the air seemed to warm ever so slightly. Noah stepped outside, the cold biting at his skin but no longer overwhelming. The world was still, almost serene. The storm that had kept him confined for so long had finally passed, leaving behind an untouched white expanse that stretched out before him like a new beginning. The cabin had survived. His makeshift heater had kept the worst of the cold at bay, and though his food stores were running low, he had made it through. His body ached from the constant strain, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had faced the storm head-on and come out the other side. He breathed in deeply, the cold air filling his lungs. It was still harsh, but there was a sense of renewal in it now. Noah had learned much during the past weeks about survival, about the wilderness, and most of all, about himself. The thaw would come soon, and when it did, he would be ready. He would rebuild what had been lost, and he would move forward. The wilderness was harsh, but it was also full of promise. And for the first time in weeks, Noah Patterson felt hopeful for the future.